Welcome to the Finding the Magic podcast, where books come alive. I'm Tricia Copeland, a fiction author and host of this show. If you love books, finding great reads, and hearing about the story behind the story directly from the authors, this is the place for you. Whether you like fantasy, science fiction, dystopian, or romance titles, I think you'll find something to love in my playlist. Listen in to discover something magical about a book or two today. Welcome, Chad.
Hello, glad to be
How are
here.
you? Thank you for being here. Today we have thriller author Chad Boudreaux. Did I get that right?
It's Boudreaux. Very close.
Boudreaux.
Mhm.
Boudreaux. Thank you. Sorry, my pronunciation is not always good. Super excited for you to be here. You have a new book out, and I'm going to get it wrong. Mobsters, right?
Mob justice.
Mob Justice, which is a follow-up to Scavenger Hunt. So
Mhm.
excited to jump into these thrillers. Do you want to talk about Scavenger Hunt first or your new book first?
Happy to start with Scavenger Hunt because that was my debut novel. It published 3 years ago, roughly. And it's a story about a protagonist named Blake Hudson, who's a young lawyer at the Department of Justice here in Washington, D.C. And he gets caught up with a clandestine group that has, very good aspirations to start out with, and then starts doing things that are kind of surreptitious of the law, and he gets caught up in that, and it changes his life, and he goes from being the hunter to the hunted. And that was a book that I wrote while I was at the Department of Justice for the most part. And then fast forward several years, I have another book that was in between, and there were so many people that wanted another scavenger hunt that we did a sequel, and this is the sequel. So I don't want to spoil it for the first time readers of Scavenger Hunt, but Blake Hudson is back, and he's in a new role, and he's getting in trouble again, and he has to work his way out of it, and we'll see what happens.
Interesting. So you have that insider perspective for this character.
Yeah, so I started at the Department of Justice when I was 28 years old. I had been a litigator in Austin, Texas for about 3 years after law school. And literally the night before the September 11 attacks, I was hired to come up to DC and work at Main Justice. And I kind of got thrown into the world of terrorism, all aspects of it from litigation to operations. And it really changed my world, not as much as it changed others' worlds, obviously, but I was fascinated by, all the things that were going on in our country and our world, and really started to inspire me to write. And so I had access to people and places here. And so I really try to take people behind the curtain when we talk about what we're doing in the books to kind of show them what goes on behind the scenes, both interactively and then also just geographically. And the building, the main justice building, which was the center of Scavenger Hunt, and to a large extent, Mob Justice is a fascinating building that most people don't get access to, and so I try to paint that picture for everyone.
Yeah, because you think of an attorney in the Department of Justice probably is mostly attorneys. But you would think that you would be behind a desk or maybe in a courtroom most of the time. Is that not true, or is there more to it than that?
There's actually a lot more to it than that. So if you think about the Department of Justice, you definitely have some, and I'll take myself out of this, but some of the brightest lawyers in the world who get to either prosecute or defend the biggest cases that our country sees. They have all the cases on behalf of the government in front of the judicial branch, including the Supreme Court. And so these are big cases that really affect our culture and our communities, and certainly our rule of law. But then also when you take all the geeky lawyers like me out of it, you have law enforcement, federal law enforcement that people are very familiar with. The FBI is a part of the Department of Justice, and
Okay.
I spent a lot of my time at DOJ, and dealing with FBI policy. And so walk across the street from Main Justice on Ninth and Pennsylvania, and you're at the FBI Hoover Building. And FBI, I love our FBI special agents and everybody onto the top. I mean, the former FBI director, is on the front cover of my book endorsing the book. But they really believe they're separate unless they have a budget challenge, and then they want to come back to Mother Justice and be a part of us. But DEA, Marshal Service, all, Bureau of Prisons, um, they all are a part of the DOJ, and there's more to it than that. But yeah, you have it right. It's a big umbrella. They do a lot of things, and the great thing about that is, if you want, like me, if you want to write about a protagonist that works at the Department of Justice, it gives you a broad swath of ideas and license to go really anywhere you need to.
So what is so Blake Hudson is looking at terrorism in scavenger hunt, correct?
Yes.
And trying to prevent terrorism, which obviously on the heels of 9/11, very important and still
Right.
very important to our society and in our society. Um, did you, were you involved in any terrorist cases?
I was, and I went from, pretty much defending doctors in Texas and other professionals in litigation to becoming pretty much a terrorism lawyer. And, that included helping defend some of the cases that were terrorist related. But then also, my first day on the job at DOJ was meeting with the victims of 9/11. So I was hired right before I actually got into town a couple of weeks later, and we were meeting with the survivors of people who had died in New York. Family members and coworkers who had survived, and we were trying to set up, and we did, what was called the September 11th Victim Compensation Fund. And that fund was a taxpayer funded fund that basically gave money to the victims in the trade-off. It was a congressionally passed, but DOJ administered it. But that was basically a way to save the airlines from bankruptcy, from people suing the airlines for what happened. And ultimately, it was, I think, a very successful fund. Both Democrats and Republicans heralded it as one of the best programs, and to be a part of that was great. But that's just one example of really what we did. There's a Netflix show with Michael Keaton starring as Ken Feinberg, who I worked with very closely every day for several years, who was the special master of that fund. And I think the show's called Value, but it's really a great show, and it captures, I think, the spirit of what we went through for several years.
Interesting. Yeah, that seems like it would be very emotionally draining to help all of those victims or big families of the victims um, that survived the 9/11 attack, and would leave a huge impression. I was in Pennsylvania. Well, wasn't I lived in Pennsylvania over 9/11, and we were actually in Germany, but another story. Anyway, yeah, so I can imagine that would have been very hard and challenging, just emotionally as well as mentally too, but also maybe very rewarding.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, it was rewarding because it was one of those times in recent history that are few and far between, where both parties kind of came together and supported what we were doing. And Ken Feinberg, I'll just give a shout out to him. He has special skills that few people have in terms of bringing people together. A brilliant man, but also very empathetic, sympathetic. And we visited Shanksville, we visited Manhattan, obviously, and Arlington here. I'm right next to the Pentagon tonight, and the emotions, you know, were just something I had never seen before. And so it definitely humbles you, and it makes you thankful for every day when you meet with people like that. And you have a job to do, and there's some blocking and tackling there, and there's some legal requirements, congressional requirements. But yeah, there was a big emotional factor for all of us, and to have that program succeed the way it did was definitely rewarding.
That's really neat. Well, circling back to Blake Hudson, your main character, is the book written through his eyes and his words, or is it a third person account?
It is third person, but it's it's through his lens, and for
Okay.
the most part. I mean, there are other characters in the book that I think really bring the book together and give you different perspectives. So you have a Delta Force operative, and you have a CIA ground branch person who's a part of the team, and then a woman from NSA who is kind of the shadow, if you will. She's always we're always trying to figure out what she's up to, and then another kind of like a smoking man from X-Files, if you will, that's kind of leading the group. But for the most part, it's through Blake's eyes in the third person. But then I do give you a glimpse of what the other people are doing and thinking, and spend a lot of time. I mean, Blake Hudson, that's my world. It's not me, but it's an amalgamation of many people that I've known through the Department of Justice. Really didn't know like Delta Force that well, and so I reached out to people who knew better than I did and got a good sense of what they did, and along with the other characters. So I try to give you a glimpse of how their world operates, and then how they view the world. But it's more in snippets than you know a current that flows through the book.
Right. And so what can we expect? Does Scavenger Hunt wraps up to some degree? I'm guessing that maybe the main storyline or main goal is somehow achieved or horribly not achieved, as can happen in thrillers. Is it a different challenge in Mob Justice?
Yeah, it's a different challenge as me as a writer, and for Blake Hudson, who I've already spoiled, survived scavenger hunt. But
Okay.
anybody who picks up the book from the first page probably knows he's going to survive. But how is he going to do it is kind of the fun part, and then hopefully they'll fall in love with some other characters, and they may not survive. We'll see. But anyway, you were right, like beginning to say, like the acuteness of the terrorism threat, at least in a way that we saw on 9/11, isn't something that we wake up with every day. Now, with geopolitical things being what they are today in 2026, we are seeing an uptick in certain terrorist activity in our country, more on the localized level. Um, and we'll keep an eye on that. But the issues in scavenger hunt are still just as relevant today, because one of the things that I tried to do is write a spy thriller for Scavenger Hunt that was apolitical, meaning that, or at least small p, politics. So I try to give you the politics and let you decide when you have a Blake Hudson who is trying to do the righteous thing, but then he's faced with almost an untenable situation where if he doesn't do the wrong thing, people's lives are definitely at stake. And so all the stuff that you see on Fox News or CNN, whatever newscast you see, you never get like the real conundrum that people in theater actually have to deal with. And so, being a part of that to some extent, I wanted to share with the reader that. And I think a lot of the feedback that I've gotten on Scavenger Hunt, really, they press into that and they say, we didn't appreciate that perspective, or we appreciated, like for the pros that do know it, we appreciated that you brought forth that perspective because we don't hear that anywhere. And so I don't ever come down on the side, but I let you decide. And I'm not trying to educate, I'm trying to entertain. But along the way, when hopefully you're having a really good time reading a thriller that keeps you interested from the beginning to end, I hope the reader walks away with, hey, I did have another perspective here, or I did learn something here along the way. It's kind of the same thing with mob justice. So now Blake is, you know, gotten a little trouble with scavenger hunt, so now he's got to get out of the doghouse and he's assigned a new mission. And so now he goes from really in DC to Chicago. And in mob justice, we're dealing with the Chicago Mafia. Traditionally, the Chicago Mafia, back right before Prohibition, had two main gangs, and they were north and south of the Chicago River. You had the North Side Gang on the north, and you had the South Side Gang on the south, which ultimately turned into the Chicago Outfit. And the Chicago Outfit is what Capone led, and that's the name that most people will be familiar with. And so this is not a historical novel, but the shadow of Capone, the ghost of Capone, kind of is a current that goes through the book and kind of drives behavior. And Blake is now a prosecutor in theater in Chicago dealing with issues with the mafia there.
Interesting. Yeah, I feel like with thrillers, to me, well, this is giving away what I watch a lot, but so it's like medical dramas, right? Thrillers are sort of like that. Like, like what you have to do to cure the person or surgery goes on, right? Like political thrillers, you have this hierarchy of like the senators and the representatives, and they make the laws, and they have everybody under them that have to figure out how to carry them out. And it seems like you're giving us that inside behind the curtain look of how things really get done as prescribed by whatever like hierarchy law is decided on. So just like in a medical drama or surgery, lots of little things have to go on under under the guise of this is what you're supposed to do, or this is what's supposed to happen in the end.
Yeah, and so for Mob Justice, again, I felt like I felt pretty confident that I knew how to write the book without doing a whole lot. My research was really on the mafia and not really on how prosecutors prosecute the mafia. So I've never been a prosecutor of the mafia, but I had three mentors in my career that were like the most famous of all, of bringing down the mafia. And so I listened to their stories and their amazing stories. Two of them have passed. I dedicated my book to one of them who was my mentor for several years. And but there was a part of me where I really had to write about wiretapping because wiretapping is so important in prosecuting the mob. That's just that's how they get evidence in so many of the cases, and I'd never done that before. And so I had this great, few chapters where really getting in. I don't really get into the details of it that much, but and then I shared it with, some of my former colleagues who were experts in that area, and they said, Chad, that's not how we talk. And that's not how it's done. Like, this is how it's done. And so they walked me through it. And so I learned a lot, but then I was also very capably able to demonstrate, how that works for the reader. So I think I got it. I think I got it right. And if I get sign off from some of those tough, former FBI guys and otherwise, then I feel pretty comfortable with it. But that was the challenge in mob justice for me, was really learning all that wiretapping lingo and how it works in practice.
Interesting. Yeah. I was sat on a jury, and it's the first time I ever sat on a jury, and it was a drug trial. And I learned so much about like all the evidence gathering and how Facebook Messenger is really going to bring you down. It's like never use Facebook Messenger if you do a crime. So I can appreciate that wiretapping would be a similar like entity unto its own. So and I think that readers really appreciate you getting things really right because they like, well, at least when I'm reading a book, I like that I'm learning something as well as getting a good fun story.
Yeah, so for me, writing my first book and even every book I write now, that's going to be a scavenger hunt, part of the scavenger hunt series. And I think all the books that I am able to write from this point will fall into that category just because the feedback has been so good. And all my stories that I have in my head, maybe 10 of them,
Oh,
um,
wow.
are all kind of, I've got so many characters in scavenger hunt that people like that I can now branch off and do a lot of things with them, not just with Blake, but when I published my first book, I had several hurdles to go to your point. I had several hurdles I had to overcome, not just in the publishing community and in the literary community, which is very tough. I mean, those listeners and viewers for this I mean, many of them will have written books or are trying to write books. And to a person that I've talked to, it's tough. It's a tough community. They're very candid and can be harsh, and you have to have thick skin. But I also had to go through the legal community, the intel community, and the law enforcement community. And if I get anything wrong in my book as it relates to what they do, they're just going to put it down. They won't read it anymore. And so it is very important that I get it accurate.
Right. Yeah, and it'd be interesting to me to know if people in that community with those jobs read the thriller books, or do they go read a fun romance and not even think about their job when they get off work, or fantasy or sci-fi or something unrelated to what they do?
Yeah, I mean, it's not certainly not monolithic in any of those communities. I'm sure they have all sorts of passion and
Yeah.
interests. I tend to read the books that I mean, I definitely read a lot of history and biographies, but I tend to read fiction that is in line with what I like to write about. So Ludlum and Clancy and Meltzer and those kind of authors appeal to me. I will say this though, this is actually something I did not expect. But I have beta readers, and a lot of my beta readers are those experts in the field, so law enforcement, intelligence, legal. Because Blake's a prosecutor, I always have prosecutors read my book ahead of time. And the prosecutor, and then I have this editor who's amazing. And my editor wants Blake to get in all sorts of trouble and do all these things wrong because it makes for a better story. And the prosecutors hate that
I was
because
going
they
to say
they
lawyers
want
don't
Blake
want
to do
that.
everything by the book. And so I have to like bridge this gap between these two worldviews. And I tell the prosecutors, like, nobody's going to want to read a book where Blake just does all the right things. Like, that's no fun.
Yeah.
And so when you read my books, you'll always see a comment or two along the way that says, where Blake says, a prosecutor would never do this, but I'm going to do it anyway.
I'm going to do it
And
anyway.
just so you know that is me making sure that I still have a pipeline to the experts in the prosecutorial community.
They still talk to you. Well, right, because you're going to get disbarred, right? If you step outside the lines. I mean, that's so easy to do.
What's even worse, I won't have any experts to read my books. I mean, I'm happy to be disbarred and write books if I'm doing a good job at it, but I've got to have some help.
Well, no, I meant your character's going to get disbarred. He'll never work again.
Oh, that's
So
true. That's true.
that's a complete other storyline where you can go into the real, like, real underground.
Good point.
So do you have your next book, I guess, outlined out?
I do. I'm a scaffolding outliner, so I usually try to aim for 50 chapters, 2,000 words a chapter. I mean, that's not the gospel, but so I live in a world, so I'm a chief legal officer of a company that, does some pretty cool things, but it's all about rules and regulations. And so I live in that world, and I don't want to be in that world when I'm writing fiction. And I think that's why I like writing fiction, because there really are no rules, at least until it comes to publishing requirements. But I found that I have to have some guidelines or some guidepost rather, or I can't function. And so I have to have that scaffolding. So for me, I say 50 chapters, 2,000 words, and I'll write a little bit a day. Some days I'll write 3 words, some days I'll write 3,000 words, and that keeps me sane. And so in the spirit of that, I'm continue to write, and I'm on my 4th book now. I think the tentative title is going to be Border Fall. It'll be a scavenger hunt series book. Like I said, all of them should be from this point. And I'm very excited about it. And I spent a lot of time kind of on the border and all the different issues that we're dealing with now, like with border security. I mean, ICE is in the news, all that. Again, it'll be an apolitical book where, anybody from any worldview can pick it up and feel comfortable reading it, but it'll be one where I at least outline the issues that the characters will have to deal with in a pretty in a way where the tension takes them to where they have to make hard decisions.
Right. Interesting. So you mentioned you have 3 books. Your third book is Homecoming Queen, right?
That's my second book.
Your second book, sorry.
Yeah, so I wrote Homecoming Queen like right after Scavenger Hunt was published. And so I and I'm so glad that I did, because that was the book that I just kind of had on my mind all the time. It's a love song to my hometown. It's a small town political thriller. The protagonist there is a young woman named Annika Raven, and she has to come back to her hometown in South Texas, which I think is, if there's ever a melting pot that I've ever seen, it's South Texas, just a totally distinct area of the world. And she has to come back home to save her little sister from a house of neglect. And there's a huge Category 5 hurricane that's barreling down through the Gulf there. And that one is probably more like we talk about Robert Ludlum, and we got a cute dog right
Yeah,
there
I
who looks
know,
a
we
lot like
do.
my dog. Um, but it's a lot less Robert Ludlum and a little bit more like Stephen King, not horror, definitely
Okay.
not horror, but more of that kind of thriller.
Okay, interesting. And you said small, kind of small town politics type.
Yeah, so you have a very powerful mayor who is very manipulative, and a sheriff's department that is doing her bidding, and then Annika gets caught up in all of this. And the problem with Annika, she tries to get out of town and she can't, and so she's roped in, and she does some pretty amazing things, and it's fascinating because I I never thought that I would write a book like this. But the response for that book from a whole different kind of audience was so overwhelming that I've gotten pressure to write a sequel to that one. And I don't have that on my mind right now, but I can see maybe if I live long enough, I might, bring some of those characters back. But that book was easy to write because it was my hometown. I know a lot about hurricanes. I know a lot about, that area. And it was funny because when you talk about outlining, Stephen King in his book on writing has, this chapter where he talks about he has the muse that kind of comes to him when he goes and writes for several hours, but it takes him several hours before the muse shows up. And he talks about how his characters are kind of take over the story. And I always looked at that, and I'm a pretty realistic person. And I'm kinda like, that's really hokey. That's way too dramatic for me. But um, but I kind of understand what he's talking about, because when I wrote Homecoming Queen, I had a completely different outline until I got to like chapter 20. And then I started putting Annika Raven, the protagonist, in all of these situations where nobody else could get out. And for her to get out, she started acting in ways that, I mean, clearly it's coming from my deranged head, but she was driving things. And the great thing about that was it made the story so much better. And but anyway, so now when I go back and I read that and I hear people talking about it, I don't think it's kooky anymore. I think it's actually the way it works.
Interesting. Yeah, that's always fun when the character kind of just takes over and writes their own story because you've created them, but you've created such, at least for me, I create such a backstory and I feel like I know them so intimately. And if I get in the headspace of what would this person do next, given whatever circumstances I've put them in, then it kind of just drives itself.
Yeah, and when you think about it, like they already have behaviors that can't be changed. And so when you get to that next step, which you hadn't thought of before, there's only one or two ways they can act. And so I usually go with like the craziest way they can act, and it's out. So
Well, it's Texas, right? You go big or go home.
that's right. That's right.
Well, so much fun having you here, Chad. Tell everyone where we can find you and your books.
Yeah, so it's just my name. So it's my website. So it's www.chad, C-H-A-D, Boudreaux, Boudreaux.com. Or you can search
Great.
me on, if you can't remember that, you can get on, because I know it's a hard name. You can just type Amazon and Chad B and Mob Justice, and you'll find exactly what you need.
Fun. Chad Boudreaux. Did I get it right that time?
Got it. Perfect.
Yay! With Scavenger Hunt series, Scavenger Hunt Mob Justice, and Homecoming Queen. Thank you for being here, and I hope you'll come back when you release your next book.
Thank you so much. I'd love to do that.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Finding the Magic podcast. I'm your host, author and podcaster Tricia Copeland, and I love getting behind the scenes. If you like the podcast, make sure to subscribe and stop in each week to discover new authors and books. Thanks for listening, and until next time, keep finding the magic.